I am more than beginning to think that there has been a cover-up about the person of Paul. Now, this is not a cover-up for the bad or for the good, or I'm certainly not trying to prosecute Paul for something that happened 2,000 years ago. However, I think we need to try to know an alternate history, because the history we have is so loaded with lacunae, holes. I just have one more thing to look up here. Okay, I found what I'm looking for. I was looking for the death of Paul and what the church historians have to say about that. And so I haven't looked at that yet. I certainly know the Apocrypha regarding that. And of late, there have been claims that a particular church in Rome that is attributed to Paul the Apostle as being the place of his death has been again reiterated by the Catholic authorities that it is, because of some of the questions by outsiders that how could it be when we don't have a firm history of Paul having anything to do with this place. I just want to pop that into my Microsoft Notes. The cover-up has to do with Paul's death or Paul's life beyond the Acts of the Apostles. Let's see, I need to put this in a little better order. Almost ready. Again, sorry for the wait. I had a rehearsal tonight. I play a concert once a month during the season down here. And it's a piano concert. And I do piano in duet style with my Aunt Jane. Aunt Jane is, as I am, an advanced player, although I'm far behind her in that advancement. Aunt Jane, she's 18 years older than I am. What would that be? 82 years old. She was my babysitter at times when I was an infant. And she's right here in Vero Beach. And since I've been here, Jane and I, who used to play together a lot in the 1960s and 70s, because I was involved in music programs at school, and she was a great player, so she accompanied me a lot. Got together again in these last 10 years and joined up with the Vero Beach Club that presents that concert once a month from November through April of piano four hands. So I've been doing it myself about 5 years or so, and we're going into this new season that begins November the 9th. Isn't this interesting? And the music that we play is very uptown, which makes our piano playing a little different than the other ones that are in the group. We play a lot of Latin stuff and very difficult compositions that sometimes we play them great, sometimes we don't. I have a lot of recordings of them, including we made together last year. I almost hate to say this, but we did a Christmas music album. There's nothing wrong with Christmas music, especially when you divorce the words from the music. There's nothing to complain about. It's beautiful, beautiful music, and in the arrangements we used, they were quite touching and moving. But I never put them out from my perspective. I never gave them away or sold them. I had lots and lots of them. Only had one left because of the picture they chose for the front of the CD. I'm loath to show it to you. And so I'm not going to. I don't know where they got this picture at. Oh, yes, I do. Last Sukkot, I mean the one in 2016. I went to Virginia to Weigel's residence there. They've got a nice camp set up for Sukkot, and we did our Yahad thing there. And it got mighty cold and during part of the time, and I had just come from Manitoba. So in Manitoba, I had purchased a sweatshirt with a hood on it. And I was wearing that there in Virginia, and unfortunately it looked a lot like a Santa Claus outfit. And so somebody snapped a picture of me there, probably Commander Lee, and passed it on, and somehow somebody got a hold of it that did the graphics for this album. I don't know how. So I couldn't pass it out anywhere. Well, yes, Wesley, one of the reasons his revival was so successful, and he turned the entire nation, that is England and actually Wales and Ireland too, around from a political massacre of those that were in office, was from these hymns. Drinking songs turned Christian with beautiful words, and not only beautiful, but theologically correct words. So can you come on, Allison, and sing a little bit of Help Me Yahweh? Help me Yahweh, help me Yahweh, something like that. Oh, come on, Allison. Interrupt me anytime if you're going to sing. We're working on a book right now, Vanessa and I, of the songs and poems of Rob Dominique, who's a fan. Okay, no mic. I'm going to send you one. Yes, I am. Rod and Paula Dominique live in Arkansas. And Rob is a writer of poems, and Paula is an author of music. And several months ago, they sent me a book of beautiful poems and music together, where they use a lot of modern kind of pop music to express their poems. Well, it's easy to get around the copyright thing because all you have to do really is to reset the melodies, and then you're fine. So Nessa's working on that now, and we're hoping we're going to be able to release that in the next month. If you're a good editor, I got lots of stuff for you to do. There's one in particular that I want to get done soon, but haven't personally had the time, and that's a new edition of the Temple Scroll. You might know that Onia Carlson, a few years ago, took all the different fragments of the Temple Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls and concatenated them together to form the most complete Temple Scroll that we have. And he wrote a commentary with that. The commentary's fabulous. Why? Because in that commentary, he is able to prove that the Temple Scroll was the Deuteronomy of the Essenes, the Deuteronomy of the Bible up until the New Deuteronomy came through the editing of the priests, mostly editing things out. How does he prove that? Let me tell you the strategy he used, because it was really smart. He has a great deal of knowledge concerning so-called apocryphal and pseudepigraphical texts. Since he was a youth, he read these over and over again, and a lot of them he has memorized almost like a computer search engine. You can ask him a question, he'll come up with where it is. He noticed that a lot of the apocryphal literature quoted the Torah. So he found all those quotes he could, separated them from their original document, tried to find them in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Well, a lot of these weren't there. The authors of the works were specifically saying that these works were from the Torah. These quotes were from the Torah. Yet they're not in the Torah that we have. However, he claims that he found all of these anti-logical sayings in the Temple Scroll. So with his Temple Scroll, he has a commentary that shows you specifically how he got to the understanding that the Temple Scroll is the actual and true early Deuteronomy. Of course, I was really skeptical, but I read his work and his commentary, and I'm convinced. He got me convinced. The guy ought to have some kind of recognition for that. That's something that scholars of these documents should know and should have come upon, but some kid did instead. He hasn't tried to exploit it or anything. What he's done is he's given me this to try to edit and publish, because his the way he concatenated everything together and then used excuse me, Elizabethan King James language to put it together is not in the reader's best interest to try to tackle, because it's a long text. That's the one I want to do very soon and get it out to you. How do we get to buy this? Buy? Do I ever sell anything? Yes, I do. Glad you brought that up. I sell Mitragyna speciosa. I sell mahuang extract and guarana extract and some books. I think what's going to happen with this when I finish it, and it shouldn't take very long, is I'm going to have a membership drive of the Yahad for actual members, and I'll make this a premium download for members only. That's what I'm thinking of doing. Yeah, in e-form, but also I surely will publish this through some self-publishing place. And what I charge for my books is just enough to cover a little bit of labor, that's all, and make that available that way. This is a tremendous piece of work. It really is. It's just like an unpolished diamond. It's got to be polished up. Anyway, then I better get on it soon. Really, what I wanted to do is get back to some music. You know, I've got this big organ in the house here now, and I've got a stack of electronic keyboards I haven't touched for 3 years. But what do the people demand? Premium content. Honestly, this is something you can't get anywhere else, and I'm the type of person that gives this stuff away, but I got to give Onia something for it, so we'll make it premium content. And for you that are on here, if you're interested in it, and you should be, just let me know that you are on this that you're on this advertisement, and I'll send it to you without charge. I will try to get it done the next couple weeks. Let's go on to Paul and the cover up. And Liz, I'm especially glad that you're here, because I want to make it clear that I am not a Paul hater. I'm one that feels that Paul is absolutely necessary for our understanding. First of all, for us even knowing Messiah, we wouldn't know him without Paul, probably, unless by some miracle. But second of all, Paul gives us all kinds of information about that time of living, and also about this process of spiritualization that we wouldn't normally have without him. And how do we prove that right if Paul's a false apostle? How do we prove that he is? We can't through that literature, because his pattern of spiritual gifts and resurrection and many, many other topics proves to be true, at least in the genuine letters of Paul, which are 7 that we know of. And maybe the other 6 are as well. It just doesn't seem that way, because especially in Colossians and Ephesians, the theology changes so much there. I'm thinking about 2 Timothy, because that's brought up in the last couple sessions here. And 2 Timothy has these people in it that certainly he knew, and I don't find anything in that book that makes it seem unoriginal. Personally, but I'm not the scholar that can make those kind of decisions. But generally, scholars put that somewhere around late 2nd century. That doesn't seem right to me. Why would late 2nd century people be referring back to some pretty obscure people in the 1st century? I'm speaking again about 2 Timothy 4, excuse me, Linus, Claudia, Eubulus, Rufus, Pudens, etc. So we'll start tonight at Acts 28, and this will probably go on for 2 sessions. My intention is just to inform you. That is all. And of course, my own viewpoint will come through here and there. I believe, and Liz believes, that people should know everything about it and be able to choose appropriately. Acts 28 at the end of 14. And so we came to Rome. This is the end of the we passages that start somewhere around chapter 17. Whereas the writer of this epic has sources, whether it was himself or some other source, that take us back to the actual travels of Paul. When he's talking about we're talking about either an early source or we're talking about the actual writer of this. And the brothers there in 15, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. I'll bet you that when Paul went into the 3 taverns, he didn't meet a Baptist in there. On seeing them, Paul thanked Elohim and took courage. Brothers there. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. The soldier who guarded him. Keep that in mind. After 3 days, verse 17, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they examined me, they wished to set me at liberty, because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case." Would not have Paul have known? Of course he would. He's arrested. He's studious. Doesn't he, growing up in Tarsus, know the Roman law? You better believe he did. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. What Caesar? At this particular time, if this is historically correct, he would probably be appealing to Claudius Caesar. But by the time he got there, he probably was talking about, he would have to talk about Nero Caesar. Claudius was bad enough, Nero was worse. Though I had no charge to bring against my nation. In other words, I'm not going to convince anybody that you Jews are bad or you're giving me a hard time. For this reason, therefore, I've asked to see you and speak with you, since it's because of the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain. And they said to him, "We have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. This is in Rome. The accusers here are religious leaders from a province far away from Rome. You would expect that they wouldn't be coming along, but that they would contact those in authority in Rome to let them know that this guy was coming and to condemn him. But none had come. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against." Was it spoken against in Claudius' time? Probably not. I'm thinking that there is something of a hiccup in the time zone here. It really began to be spoken against in the later reign of Nero. We've got to remember that the writer here is writing somewhere in the mid-90s, and we'll go into that just a little more when I get it farther down. When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. From morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of Elohim and trying to convince them about both Yahshua, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. And disagreement among themselves, they departed after Paul had made one statement. The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet, and here Paul pees in the pool. Go to this people and say, you will indeed hear but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they should have closed, lest they should see with their ears, and hear with their ears, see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of Elohim has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen. Verse 30, he lived there 2 whole years at his own expense, and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of Elohim and teaching about Messiah Yahshua with all boldness and without hindrance. How? If what he was doing was against the law, and if what he was doing was being prosecuted, even to the extent of standing before the emperor. Just note that Paul stayed by himself in Rome, supposedly with 1 soldier guard, in 2 years. When conferring with the Jewish leaders in Rome, he was found faultless. They hadn't received any arrest report. Paul reported that there was no crime worthy of death. Paul was able to teach boldly with no hindrance. Paul probably wouldn't have stayed at his own expense as we think of it today. Consider his friends in Rome. Some we dealt with last time. Claudia, the favorite of Emperor Claudius, the Druid princess. Linus, her brother, supposedly the 2nd pope, now called Saint Linus, the son of Caradoc, the British general, and Rufus, who is mentioned as his half-brother, besides Nero's freedman Epaphroditus and what seems to be his almost best friend, or at least pen pal, Seneca. All these people were living in palaces. We see Paul in some little hovel outside Rome in the Jewish slum. I would hope that if I was dispossessed, that I could call some of you, even if you don't live in palaces, and you would take me in. Wouldn't they take him in? The point I'm making is, if he had these friends, if these letters are genuine, Romans, Philippians, 2 Timothy, then he would not be living in squalor. Rather, in palaces. There's an inscription on the memorial in the church of St. Pudens in Britain. It was following the execution of Praxedes in the 2nd century, who was the last surviving member of the original family of Claudia and Pudens. That inscription, in this sacred and most ancient of churches, known as the Pastor Hermas, dedicated by St. Paul, formerly the house of Sanctus Pudens, the senator, and the home of the holy apostles, reposed the remains of 3,000 blessed martyrs, which Pudentiana and Praxedes, virgins of Christ, with their own hands interred. So we find another reference to Pudens and Claudia here. The interment of the last surviving child of Pudens and Claudia in a memorial place in Britain, which helps us to understand that some believe that Paul spent his last house arrest in the house of Pudens in Rome. A Roman senator, a prince of the Druids, who was actually able to go back home, even though in the interdict of Claudius, and well known here hundreds of years after he lived. It's certain that Luke wrote in the 90s, 30 years after the fact. Why didn't Luke go on to write about Paul's glorious martyrdom? It seems like that would be the high point of his whole life, would be in his death, because in his later letters, he's almost boasting about going to his death. Now, was Paul's use of impending doom genuine in his letters, or was it a publicity stunt? If what Acts is saying is correct, Paul had no fear whatsoever of standing before Nero, especially with Seneca on hand, or of his arrest when the Jews had nothing to accuse him of. Why, if he was martyred, did Luke stop here? And why didn't he go on to tell about the Jewish war? Well, in a way he did, but he made it a prediction in Luke 21, starting at chapter 20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those inside the city must leave, and those in the country must not enter, for these are the days of vengeance, as a fulfillment of all that is written. Indeed, the Great Tribulation. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress on the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken away as captives among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke knew full well about this because he's writing prophecy after the fact. I know that gets to some people as being dishonest, but it was a literary style at that time. And we can understand as prophecy of what happened 40 years after it was given, or we can hold out for this to be happening in the future as dispensationalists do. Still, there is the fact that Luke knew. And Luke knew what had happened to Paul. And there's no writing in Luke that refers to Paul's death. And one other question, why does Luke's testimony throughout seem so pro-Roman? We'll do a little more of that later. What happened to Paul during those 2 years or beyond the 2 years? Let's look to the church fathers to see what we can get through the tradition of the church. Eusebius, Chrysostom, Jerome. These are writers that were full of themselves, but writers that also conveyed truthful notices of that time. They all write that Paul went to Spain after being released from his house arrest in Rome. In fact, Jerome writes it this way: Paul was dismissed by Nero, that he might preach Christ's gospels in the West. There's a connection here between Nero and the Gospels. Could it be that Seneca's letters finally bore fruit in Nero? Or that Paul, as in apocryphal literature, was considered to be something of a special magician by Nero, and thus let him go? But Jerome clarifies it a little bit to say that at this time, Nero's wickedness had not yet broken forth. That would tell us that it would have to be somewhere around 62 AD. And then tradition says that somewhere in the 14th year of Nero, Paul was put to death. The 14th year of Nero was 68 AD. Between 62 and 68 are 6 long years. Nero's wickedness had not yet broken forth, says Jerome, and Paul was dismissed. Eusebius and Jerome especially can be trusted. It was Eusebius that went all the way from Palestine to Edessa to go into the city records and find the letters between King Abgar and Joshua. And in his histories, he affirmed the fact that he was there and he witnessed these documents and he copied these documents and passed them on to us. Jerome also, I'm reading a biography of Jerome, full of himself, yet at the same time, immaculate in his presentation of what he considered true. And Jerome lived with the Nazarenes and studied with the Nazarenes for years in Palestine. Went on to become a desert father. Translated the Bible from Greek into Latin. This goes on to say, then came St. Paul to Britain. Theodoretus, who writes, well, sometime after the fact, 435 or so, says that Paul preached the gospel to the Britons and others in the West. That's from De Carandis Graecorum Affectionabis. After the investigation of the subject, Capella states, I scarcely know of one author from the time of the fathers downward who does not maintain that St. Paul, after his liberation, preached in every country in Western Europe, Britain included. We find that in the history of the apostles. Bishop Burgess writes, I don't know who this is, of St. Paul's journey to Britain, we have a satisfactory proof as any historical question can demand. Oh, yes, I do have something down about him, the researcher of the independence of the British Church. Tradition says that Paul resided in Siluria. Does that bring up anything to you from the last time we got together? Siluria is where Caractacus, Linus, and Claudia were from. Wales, in the south of Wales. And that Paul preached as far north as the banks of the River Clyde, wherever that is. That's one thing I don't have a map on, but I've got a lot of other maps here if we have time. This according to the triads of Paul the Apostle that have been handed down in ancient Welsh since the beginning of time. Now, we go to Acts 24. We're going to backtrack just a little bit. Acts 24:27. The Jews from Asia, this is where Paul preached, seeing him in the temple in Jerusalem, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." Was that a setup? The three guys that Paul had shaved their head, paid for, were they Greeks? Did the elders of the assembly set him up for death? Well, we see for sure that Trophimus was in town. Verse 29, for they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city. I don't know if Tychicus was there as well. And they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Did Paul take Trophimus into the temple? Verse 30, all the city was stirred up and the people ran together. Keep that phrase in mind, please. The city was stirred up, the people ran together, because we're going to run into something like this very soon again. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort. There's another word, please remember, tribune. We'll find it again. That all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" Now let's go to a parallel account in the Antiquities. And some of these quotes are so close to that that we can hardly help but see a correspondence. So we're talking now about Albinus, and we're back in Jerusalem. Albinus is the new governor of Jerusalem. He assembled, or I should say the governor of Syria. The governor of Syria appointed the high priests, you see. This governor appointed a high priest before he came to Syria from Rome. He appointed a high priest, and so there was a hiatus between the time the high priest, who was Ananus, the high priest came to power, and by the time Albinus got there. And in the time that Ananus was high priest, without any authority over him, he did something nasty. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Yahshua, who is called Messiah, whose name was Yaakov, James, and brought some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. That's Antiquities 29:1. Now, look, Albinus, newly appointed high priest, comes down. I'm sorry. Ananus, high priest, comes down, and his authority, the Roman governor Albinus, is not there. So he has a meeting of the Sanhedrin, the ruling authorities of the Jews, before the governor comes and without his permission. Now, Albinus had to give permission to Ananus before he could call a Sanhedrin, and that permission had not been granted. But there's some collusion here, and the collusion was to have James stoned as a breaker of the Torah. Well, we know that he wasn't a Torah breaker, but that the people loved him. Now, right after this, being in book 20, chapter 9, pericope 1, we go down 3 pericopes, or 3 verses, and we have this account. A sedition arose between the high priests with regard to one another. For they got together bodies of the boldest sorts of the people, and frequently came from reproaches to throwing of stones at each other. But Ananus was too hard for the rest by his riches. We read about his great-grandfather in the New Testament, in Luke. Annas, Caiaphas, Theophilus, Matityahu, and now Ananus. All these were in the line of Annas. So they've got the entire century wrapped up in the high priesthood. But they couldn't withstand Ananus, the other priests, because he had the money, and he came from money. His family had been in that high priesthood for about 70 years. Listen to this. Costobarus also and Saul did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family. Greet Herodian, my kinsman. And so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to King Agrippa. Yet they used violence with the people and were very ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. And from that time, it principally came to pass that our city was greatly disordered. Again, disordered. We're talking about the same time. We're talking about 62, before Nero became bad. The city is greatly disordered there in Jerusalem, and that all things grew worse and worse among us. That is in such close proximity to the execution of James, but it's not quite clear what side Saul was on. And also we have to take into account the viewpoint of Josephus, who would be certainly of the viewpoint of those same high priests. Well, it's not conclusive, but the proximity is dazzling. 3 verses different. Next, I want to go to the Sonini document, or as it's in my H.T. Anderson Sinaitic Bible, Acts 29. We went over this a little bit last time. I want to go into it a little more detail now with some maps, but since I got started 10 minutes late, I'm going to go a little bit longer. In the Sonini manuscript, we have it starting out this way. And Paul, full of the blessings of Christ and abounding in the Spirit, departed out of Rome, determined to go to Spain. Now, this is meant, whether it's genuine or not, it's meant to follow Acts 28. It's too obvious when you put them together. And it may have been in there for all we know. His style of writing is very similar. It's just the provenance of the Sonini manuscript is questionable. We're talking about those 2 years. Paul departs out of Rome, according to this, determined to go to Spain. Remember, he has a guard, at least one. And for he had a long time proposed to journey thitherward, and was minded also to go from thence, from Spain to Britain. And again, no man hindered him. Verse 4 of Acts 29. No man hindered Paul. Why should they? He's made friends with his captors. That's a good thing. For he testified boldly of Yahshua before the tribunes. You remember I told you to remember that word. Tribune. And among the people, the very words used above. And he took with him certain of the brethren which abode with him at Rome. About Linus, Rufus, Epaphroditus, same old gang? Just guessing. I think Epaphroditus wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, personally. No one hindered him. He took certain brethren that were living with him in Rome. A military tribune is Greek kiliarchos. Somebody was teaching on the millennium during Sukkot and brought up a very similar word, kilia. It's a Greek word that means thousands. This might mean just 1,000. Kili, because there's a second word tacked on there that starts with an A, kiliarchos, which would mean ruler of 1,000. Kilios is the word that is translated in Revelation as millennium. A military tribune was an officer of the Roman army who ranked below the legate and above the centurion. Young men of the equestrian rank often served as military tribunes. It's a stepping stone to the Senate. He's preaching before tribunes, and their people. The 1,000. Who would that be? He's preaching before Roman legions. He's found a way to ingratiate himself with his captors and maybe even get them saved. Verse 6. Paul preached mightily in Spain, and great multitudes believed and were converted, for they perceived he was an apostle sent from Elohim. Not much about Spain there. I'm thinking that probably he went from Rome to Cadiz. He would have to go between Spain, Hispania, and in what we call the Rock of Gibraltar, in Gibraltar, to get to Cadiz, which was just on the other side, a big port city that was used as a port since probably 300-400 BC. And they departed out of Spain, and Paul and his company, finding a ship in Armorica, sailed to Britain. Some say that our country is named, our continent is named after this place, Armorica, America. Armorica turns up in some very interesting apocryphal literature, and some have taken up the similarity in the names as perhaps the misnomer for America. Armorica, I want to show you on the map. I think you can probably, well, I'll tell you what, I will put my screen. Is anybody left here? Oh, one person left. Yeah, this is pretty slow and boring, but not all people are into this. Here's some maps. This little map here gives you an idea of where Armorica is. Here it's shown succinctly in a smaller map. Don't they call this area Brittany? I'm very curiosolitis. I'm very curiosolitis. So this area of the sticking out here of Gaul is actually named, and that's where Paul goes. You got something you want to add? Oh, please do if you do. Okay. I got my notes up a little higher. They went therein and passed along the south coast. They reached a port called Raphanus. Here. Let's see if I can get them any bigger. Picture, flip, copy. I'm sorry they're so small. They're bigger in real life. This is on the coast of Britain, the east coast of Britain. Now, if we've got a picture of Britain right here, it'd be right over here. So small. It's important because Raphanus is the Roman name for what we call sandwich today. And if you put the two together, Raphanus means radish. You can have you a radish sandwich. Have you had one? With cream cheese, they're really good. Look at the vicinity here with Londinium. London. Boudica took care of that place. Very close. Paul could have gone to London by, taking this road right here, M20. I have a map here. You can't see it well enough, but what I can show you is that the trade routes in the Roman world, they would have gone right here through Gibraltar to Cadiz, or Cadiz, however you want to pronounce that. I think it's pronounced Cadiz. They come right around here, follow the coast up here to Amorica, and then go inland here to Sandwich. Gosh, I'm hungry. I'm hungry. Yeah, I'll send links to maps in a moment. I need to be done for tonight. I'll just get us to Mount Lud and then we'll be done. Raffinus. Raffinus is the Roman name for Sandwich in Kent. In Saxon time, there was and still standing in Sandwich an old house called the House of the Apostles. And tradition has it that Paul was one of those apostles. And of course, radish and raffinus means the same thing. I could eat a radish sandwich with pimento cheese. Couldn't you, Allison Gary? Oh, man. My cupboard's spare. My checkbook's down to $7. But tomorrow's a new day. Tomorrow's the first of the month, where pennies from heaven come down. These next two maps show, well, I guess I need to go up here again. I'm sorry. Up. Let's see. And on the morrow, Paul came and stood upon Mount Lud. And the people thronged at the gate and assembled in the Broadway. This is becoming quite modern in a way. I had to do some digging for this. There's a place called Caer Lud. Caer, it's a heap of stones originally, or cairn, today we call a heap of stones. Heap of stones in the fact a fortress. And I went looking for it, and I found Caer Lud, the ruins or whatever is there now, right at this particular place. Look along the Thames in the middle of London, Londinium. I want you to look at where that is in relationship to the Thames. And look at the next map. St. Paul's Cathedral, in relation again to the Thames. And there, we suppose on Mount Lud, Lud gets the name from King Lud, one of the early kings of that particular place. And Mount Lud, really, it's a cairn or a hill, according to what I studied earlier today. It came to pass that certain Druids came unto Paul privately and showed by their rites and ceremonies that they were descended from the Yehudites that escaped from bondage in the land of Egypt. And the apostles believed these things. And he, Paul, gave them the kiss of peace. Again, I'm referring here to 2 Timothy 4, again, with the same old bunch of Druids there. King Braun, Caractacus and his family, plus Arviragus was there, his brother, and his family. And where did they live? In palaces. The Palacia Britannica, palaces that Claudius set up for them. Would Paul be living in a little hovel in a cave? I don't think so. After these things, Paul and his brethren departed from Raphinius and sailed to Actium in Gaul. I can't find that place. And Paul preached, look, to the Roman garrison and among the people. That's speaking of the Roman people in the garrison, exhorting all men to repent and confess their sins. Let me ask you, what was the message of John the Baptist? Repent, for the kingdom is at hand. What was the original message of Yeshua? Exactly the same thing. And now we have an exhortation for all to repent and confess their sins. Next, he's off. He's at Gaul now. And so Actium has to be somewhere around here. Here's Britannia, Britain. He's come right across. Actium has to be somewhere here. For there came to him certain of the Belgae to inquire of him of his new doctrine. The Belgae, of course, we call that Belgium today. The reason it's separated from the rest of the lowlands is because of language. They had a different language. And here we have Belgica right across a close span from Britannia, excuse me. The Belgica are written up many times by the Roman historians because Rome, from the time of Caesar on up, are always fighting these guys. Fighting these guys, the Belgica, the Helvetians, and a number of other tribes like the Ordovicians, and these other places here have names of tribes that you read often in Tacitus and Cassius Dio. Here's a little better picture of where Belgica was in relation to Britain and Celtica, or Gaul. All this is Gaul. And you can see, of course, that's France today. And after much preaching and toil, Paul and his fellow laborers passed into Helvetia, right here, the old name of Switzerland, and came to Mount Pontius Pilate. Now, why is there a Mount Pontius Pilate in Switzerland? Did the reformer like Zwingli go down and drag his bones out of Spain and drag him up the top of a mountain? Well, we'll leave that for next time. As for these maps, I'll give you a link to the maps. On chat. They're not up there yet, but I'll give you a link that they'll be up there in just a little bit. http jacksonsnyder.com/ what should I call it? Paul Maps. Paul Maps. Dot. What should I put it on? Oh, I'll put it on HTML page. HTML. Okay, let's try that. I'm going to look at the chat real quick again. If there's anything there. Oh, that's it. I noticed, Allison, you're a Geek Mac because somehow I found myself on your Pinterest site. All kinds of, I know how I got there. No, you won't find that page yet. It's not up yet. I have to put it up. But you've got all kinds of maps on Pinterest I just put in maps for this and that, and it ended up at your page. Wasn't that a coincidence? Well, I thank you, and we'll continue this next time. Y'all look great. I'm so happy to see you. If you want to talk about these things, I'm available. I'd love to.